The object shouldn't have been there. Not arranged like that. Not at dawn. Tobias Crowe stood at the edge of his property, staring at what he'd built during the night. 3 wooden frames positioned on distant hills, each one casting shadows that stretched wrong, moved wrong. Behind them, mirrors he'd salvaged from an abandoned stagecoach, angled to catch and throw light in patterns that made no sense to the human eye. Below, in the valley approach, he'd buried ceramic jars with their openings facing the wind, creating low frequencies that sounded like distant thunder, like hooves, like men preparing for something. He'd spent 12 hours creating an illusion of an army that didn't exist. The problem was simple. 300 Apache warriors were half a day's ride from his ranch, and he was alone. The first signs had appeared 2 days ago. Tobias had been checking the fence line near the creek when he noticed the tracks, not the usual deer or cattle trails. These were deliberate, human, made by someone who knew how to move through territory without leaving obvious marks. But Tobias had learned to read the land the way most men read newspapers. The bent grass, the disturbed pebbles, the way certain birds had gone silent in specific areas. Someone was scouting his property. By nightfall, he'd climbed to the highest point of his land and saw them in the distance. Campfires, too many to count, the kind of number that meant either a military unit or a tribal migration. He'd taken his spyglass, the one he'd kept from his days as a scout, and confirmed what his gut already knew. Apache moving east toward the only passage through the valley, the passage that ran directly through his ranch. Tobias had paced his cabin for 3 hours, calculating options. Ride for the nearest settlement. 5 days round trip, he'd be dead before help arrived. Fortify the cabin. A joke. 300 warriors would burn him out in minutes. Abandon the property. Everything he'd built, the only thing left that mattered, gone. So he'd chosen the option that made no tactical sense. The option that relied entirely on what men feared more than what they could see. He'd spent the entire night constructing a phantom military presence. Now, as the sun rose and painted the valley in shades of copper and gold, Tobias moved between his creations, making final adjustments. He attached strips of white cloth to the wooden frames, letting them flutter in the morning breeze, mimicking the movement of soldiers shifting position. He positioned old rifle barrels he'd collected over the years, propping them between rocks to create the silhouette of armed men dug into defensive positions. His hands shook as he worked, not from fear, from exhaustion, from the knowledge that everything depended on perception, on convincing 300 experienced warriors that what they were seeing was real. Tobias returned to his cabin and climbed onto the roof, settling into the position he'd prepared. From here, he could see the entire approach. The valley narrowed between 2 rock formations, creating a natural funnel. Anyone wanting to pass through had to come within range of his property. It was why he'd chosen this location years ago. Strategic value. Now, that value might be the only thing keeping him alive. He pulled out his pocket watch. 8 in the morning. If his calculations were correct, the Apache scouts would reach visual range within the hour. The main force would follow 2 hours after that. Tobias pressed his eye to the spyglass and scanned the horizon. That's when he saw the first rider emerge from the treine, moving with the careful precision of someone expecting danger. The scouts stopped at the valley entrance, studying the terrain with an intensity that made Tobias's chest tighten. The rider raised his hand. 2 more scouts appeared, flanking the first. They were communicating through gestures, pointing toward Tobias's wooden frames, toward the positions where the mirrors caught and reflected light in sharp, intermittent bursts. One of the scouts dismounted and pressed his ear to the ground. Tobias held his breath. The buried ceramic jars were designed to create vibrations, to make the earth itself suggest the presence of many men, many horses. But would it work? Or would an experienced tracker immediately recognize the deception? The scout stood slowly. He mounted his horse and made a signal. The three riders didn't advance. Instead, they retreated back into the tree-line. Tobias exhaled. They were reporting back. That meant the main force would arrive soon, but cautiously. They believed they were approaching a fortified position. He climbed down from the roof and walked to his cabin's interior. On the table sat the only weapon he truly had, a white cloth tied to a long pole. Not a flag of surrender, a flag of negotiation. Because Tobias knew something about the Apache that most settlers didn't understand. They weren't mindless raiders. They were strategic, practical, led by men who valued the lives of their warriors. If they believed an engagement would cost too many lives, they would consider alternatives. The question was whether Tobias's illusion was convincing enough to create that belief. He picked up the pole and walked outside, positioning it at the front of his property where it would be clearly visible. Then he returned to the roof, settled into his position, and waited. The sun climbed higher. The valley grew hot. Tobias's throat felt like sandpaper, but he didn't move to get water. Couldn't risk missing the moment when everything would be decided. It was just past noon when he heard them. Not the sound of hooves or men, something else. A low, rhythmic sound that took him several seconds to identify. Drums. The Apache were announcing their presence, not with stealth, but with a message. They knew Tobias was here, they knew he was watching, and they wanted him to understand that they had numbers, strength, the ability to overwhelm any defense he might have prepared. Tobias gripped his spyglass tighter and watched as the first wave of warriors emerged from the tree-line. Not 300, but enough that he could see the front edge of what was coming. They moved in organized formations, spreading out across the valley approach. Each man positioned to cover a different angle of attack. At the center of the formation rode a man who carried himself differently from the others. Older, more deliberate. His horse was better groomed. His weapons showed the wear of long use rather than decoration. This was someone who made decisions. The leader raised his hand and the entire formation stopped. They were studying Tobias's setup, the wooden frames, the mirror flashes, the rifle barrels positioned in the rocks. From this distance, with the morning heat creating shimmer and distortion, it would be nearly impossible to determine if those positions were manned or empty. Tobias watched the leader's face through his spyglass, saw the calculation happening behind those eyes, saw the moment when the man made a choice. The leader gestured, and 3 warriors broke from the formation, riding forward at a measured pace. Not an attack, a delegation. They stopped 50 yards from Tobias's property line. Close enough to speak, but far enough to retreat if necessary. One of them raised his hand in a gesture that could have been greeting or challenge. Tobias set down his spyglass. This was it, the moment where his illusion would either hold or shatter completely. He grabbed the white negotiation flag and climbed down from the roof. As he walked toward the 3 warriors, every instinct screamed at him to show strength, to project confidence, but his legs felt weak, his mouth dry. Behind these 3 men waited hundreds more, and if they decided to attack, if they saw through his deception, there would be nothing he could do except die. But Tobias had learned something during his years as a scout, something that had saved his life more times than his rifle ever had. Sometimes the craziest plan was the only one that made sense. He stopped 10ft from the warriors and planted his white flag in the ground. Then he did something that violated every rule of frontier survival. He smiled. The warrior in the center studied Tobias with eyes that had seen too many battles to be impressed by bravado. He was younger than Tobias had estimated from a distance, maybe 35, with a scar that ran from his left temple down to his jaw. His horse shifted beneath him, sensing the tension that hung in the air like smoke. Tobias kept his hands visible away from his sides, making no movement that could be interpreted as reaching for a weapon. The smile he'd forced onto his face felt unnatural, stretched too tight. But he held it there, not a smile of happiness, a smile that said he knew something they didn't. The scarred warrior spoke first, his English clear but accented. "You fly the white cloth." "You want to talk?" "I do," Tobias said. His voice came out steadier than he'd expected. "Your scouts reported what they saw. I'm guessing that's why you stopped instead of riding straight through." The warrior's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind his eyes. Recognition, maybe, or respect for someone who understood tactics. "My name is Natan," the warrior said. "I lead these men. We travel east through this valley. This is the path we must take." Tobias nodded slowly. "This is my land. The passage runs through my property. Usually, I'd have a problem with 300 armed men crossing without permission. Usually, Natan repeated his tone, suggesting he understood the implied condition. But today is different. Today is different, Tobias agreed. He gestured toward the wooden frames positioned on the hills, toward the rifle barrels jutting from rock formations, toward the entire illusion he'd constructed during the night. "Today, you've got a decision to make. You can try to force passage, which will cost you men, or we can negotiate terms that let everyone walk away breathing." Natan's eyes narrowed. He studied the defensive positions again, calculating angles, distances, fields of fire. Tobias could almost see the mathematics happening in the man's head. How many rifles did those positions represent? How many soldiers were dug in behind those rocks? What kind of casualties would a frontal assault generate? "You are one man," Natan said finally. "I see no army, no soldiers, only you and your clever arrangements." Tobias felt his stomach drop, but he kept his expression neutral. This was the moment, the point where his entire plan could collapse. "Am I?" Tobias asked. He let the question hang in the air, then added, "Your scout put his ear to the ground. What did he hear?" Natan's jaw tightened slightly. That small reaction told Tobias everything. The buried ceramic jars had worked. The vibrations they created had suggested the presence of many horses, many men. "Sound traveled strange in these valleys," Natan said. But there was uncertainty in his voice now. Not fear, just the practical weariness of a leader who valued his warriors' lives. "It does," Tobias agreed. "And light plays tricks, too, especially when you're looking at positions from a distance in the morning heat. Makes it hard to know exactly what you're facing." Natan turned to the warrior on his right and spoke in Apache. The conversation was brief, tense. Tobias caught a few words, phrases he'd learned during his scouting days enough to understand. They were debating whether the defensive positions were real or empty. The third warrior, who hadn't spoken yet, suddenly pointed toward the hills. Tobias followed his gaze and felt a spike of panic. One of his wooden frames had fallen, probably knocked over by wind. From this angle it was obvious now what it was. Just wood and cloth, no soldiers, no threat. Natan saw it too. His hand moved toward the rifle strapped to his saddle. Tobias spoke quickly. "Here's what I know about you, Natan. You're not raiders. You're moving your people east because something forced you out of your territory. Maybe soldiers, maybe settlers, maybe both. You need to cross this valley fast and quiet without drawing attention from the military patrols that work this region." Natan's hand stopped. He was listening. "And here's what you know about me," Tobias continued. "I'm not a soldier anymore. I left that life, but I still have connections. I know which routes the patrols take, which days they ride through, which commanders are looking for any excuse to engage." "You offer information," Natan said slowly. "I offer safe passage," Tobias corrected. "You cross my land tonight when it's dark, when no one can see your numbers. I give you the patrol schedules, the routes to avoid. In return, you move through fast, take nothing, hurt no one, and we forget this conversation ever happened." Natan studied him for a long moment. And if we refuse, if we decide your positions are empty, your army is shadow." Tobias met his gaze without blinking. "Then you'll find out whether I'm bluffing. And even if you're right, even if it's just me, I'll still kill at least 3 of your men before you kill me. Maybe more. Is passage through this valley worth that cost? Or would you rather take the deal and save lives on both sides?" The silence stretched between them, measured in heartbeats. Behind Natan in the distance, Tobias could see more warriors emerging from the tree-line. The main force was getting restless, wondering why their scouts and leader were taking so long. Natan glanced back at his men, then turned to Tobias again. "You were a scout. I see it in how you move, how you read terrain. Why did you leave?" The question caught Tobias off guard. It was personal, irrelevant to the negotiation, unless it wasn't. Unless Natan was trying to understand if Tobias was trustworthy, if his word meant anything. "I left," Tobias said quietly, "because I got tired of choosing between bad options and worse ones. Today, I'm offering us both a good option. Take it." Natan nodded slowly. "I will speak with my council. We will give you an answer before the sun reaches the top of the sky." He turned his horse and began to ride back toward the main force. The other 2 warriors followed. Tobias stood alone in the open ground, watching them go, feeling the sweat that had soaked through his shirt, the tremor in his hands that he'd kept hidden. The fallen wooden frame lay visible on the hill, undeniable proof that at least part of his defense was fake. And Natan had 3 hours to decide whether the rest was real or just more wood and mirrors. Tobias turned and walked back toward his cabin, every step feeling like it might be his last. Tobias sat on the floor of his cabin, back against the wall, rifle across his lap. Not because he planned to use it. The weapon was old, reliable, but utterly useless against 300 warriors. He held it because the weight felt familiar, grounding, something solid in a situation built entirely on deception. Through the window, he watched the Apache camp settling into position at the valley entrance. They weren't advancing, but they weren't retreating either. Natan was buying time, letting his council debate, probably sending scouts to investigate the defensive positions more carefully. Tobias checked his pocket watch. 1 hour had passed since the negotiation, 2 more until Natan's deadline. His thoughts drifted to the question Natan had asked. "Why did you leave?" The real answer was complicated, buried in memories Tobias had spent years trying to forget. He'd been a good scout, maybe one of the best. He could read tracks that other men couldn't see, predict movements, understand terrain in ways that saved lives. The military had valued him for that, had promoted him, given him responsibilities, asked him to make decisions that young men shouldn't have to make. The final decision had come on a morning not unlike this one. He'd been tracking a group of Apache families moving through territory the military wanted cleared. Not warriors, just families, women, children, old men. They were trying to reach a protected reservation, taking a route that technically violated boundaries, but posed no real threat to anyone. Tobias had been ordered to report their location, to call in the cavalry unit that would force them back, possibly engage if they resisted. Standard procedure, clean, simple, by the book. He'd spent 3 hours following those families, watching them struggle through difficult terrain, seeing how they protected their children, how they rationed water, how they moved with the quiet dignity of people who knew they were losing everything but refused to surrender their humanity in the process. When the time came to send the signal, Tobias had looked at the flare in his hand, then at the families below, then at the empty horizon where the cavalry waited. He'd put the flare back in his pack and ridden away in the opposite direction. By sunset, he'd removed his uniform and buried it under a rock car that marked the death of who he'd been. 2 weeks later, he'd bought this property with the last of his military pay. Now, 8 years later, he was facing the same choice from a different angle. He could have fortified his cabin, called in military support, Let the cavalry deal with Natan's people. That was the expected response, the civilized solution, the one that kept his hands clean. Instead, he'd built an illusion and offered a deal. Some men might call that wisdom, others would call it cowardice. Tobias just called it trying to sleep at night. Movement outside snapped him back to the present. 3 Apache warriors were riding toward his property again, but these weren't the same ones from before. These men moved differently, with the careful deliberation of experienced trackers. They were investigating. Tobias stood and moved to the window, watching as they approached one of his defensive positions, the closest one where he'd positioned old rifle barrels between rocks. One warrior dismounted and climbed toward the position, while the other 2 provided cover. This was bad. If they got close enough, they'd see the rifles were decades old, rusted, some of them missing crucial parts. They'd realize the entire setup was a facade. Tobias grabbed his rifle and stepped outside, moving to where he'd be visible, but not threatening. The dismounted warrior stopped his climb and looked down at him. They locked eyes across the distance. For several seconds, neither man moved. Then, Tobias did something that surprised even himself. He raised his hand in a casual gesture, not quite a wave, more an acknowledgement. The kind of gesture one man gives another when they both understand the game being played, but choose to respect the effort anyway. The warrior studied him, then looked back at the rifle position he'd been climbing toward. The decision played out on his face. He could keep climbing, confirm his suspicion, expose the bluff, or he could respect what Tobias was offering, a way out that didn't require bloodshed. The warrior climbed back down to his horse, mounted, and rode back toward the Apache camp without investigating further. Tobias released a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. But his relief lasted only seconds, because from the opposite direction, from the east, where no one should be coming from, he heard something that made his blood turn cold. Hoof beatats, multiple horses moving fast. He turned and saw them crusting the ridge. 6 riders in blue uniforms, cavalry scouts, probably on routine patrol, possibly responding to reports of Apache movement in the area. They were heading straight toward the valley, straight toward Natan's camp, straight into a situation that would explode into violence the moment they made contact. Tobias had maybe 5 minutes before the cavalry scouts spotted the Apache, maybe 3 minutes before someone opened fire. And once that happened, his carefully constructed negotiation would collapse. The Apache would assume he'd betrayed them, called in reinforcements, set a trap, they'd attack, the cavalry would engage, and the valley would become a battlefield. Everything he'd built, everything he'd risked, was about to fall apart unless he could stop it. Tobias grabbed his white negotiation flag and ran toward the approaching cavalry, knowing he was about to put himself between 2 armed forces, knowing that trying to stop what was about to happen might be the last decision he ever made. But he'd made harder choices before and lived with worse consequences. Behind him, he heard Apache drums beginning again. They'd spotted the cavalry too. The race was on. Tobias reached the cavalry scouts before they crested the final ridge that would give them a clear view of the Apache camp. He planted his white flag in the ground and raised both hands, positioning himself directly in their path. The lead rider, a sergeant with a weathered face and sharp eyes, raised his fist. The patrol stopped 20 yards away, rifles ready but not aimed yet. "Stand down, civilian," the sergeant called out. His voice carried the authority of someone used to being obeyed without question. "This is military business. Clear the area." "Can't do that." "Sergeant," Tobias said, keeping his hands visible. "I'm Tobias Crowe. This is my property, and if you ride another 50 yards, you're going to start a war nobody wants." The sergeant's eyes narrowed. He studied Tobias, then glanced at the white flag, then at the valley beyond. "Explain fast." "There's an Apache band camped at the valley entrance," Tobias said. 300 warriors, maybe more. They're moving east, trying to reach the reservation territories. They're not raiding, not attacking settlements, just passing through." One of the younger soldiers, barely 20, leaned forward in his saddle. 300 hostiles, and you're just letting them camp on your land. They're negotiating passage, Tobias said carefully. We're working out terms, peaceful terms. If you ride in there with 6 men, they'll see it as an attack. They'll defend themselves, and then more cavalry will come, and more Apache will fight, and this valley will run red before sunset. The sergeant dismounted and walked closer to Tobias, studying him with the practiced assessment of a man who'd learned to read people under pressure. You got a name I can verify, Crowe. Some way I know you're not just some sympathizer trying to help hostiles escape. I was a scout, Tobias said. 8th Infantry, worked under Captain Morrison before he transferred to the Oklahoma Territories. I left the service 8 years ago. Bought this land legally. Filed all the proper claims. Recognition flickered across the sergeant's face. Morrison, I know that name. Good officer. He paused, then added, Why'd you leave? Personal reasons, Tobias said, but I still respect the uniform. I'm not trying to undermine your mission, Sergeant. I'm trying to prevent unnecessary casualties on both sides. The sergeant looked past Tobias toward the valley. 300 warriors. That's a significant force. Command needs to know about this. We've got standing orders to report any Apache movement in this region. Report it. Tobias agreed. But give me 24 hours to finish negotiating safe passage. They'll be gone by tomorrow morning. Nobody dies. No property gets damaged. No settlers get threatened. Clean resolution, or the young soldier interjected. They use those 24 hours to fortify positions, prepare an ambush, or raid the settlements to the east. Tobias turned to the younger man. If they wanted to raid, they'd have done it already. They're not here for a fight. They're here because they got pushed out of their territory, and this is the fastest route to safety. The sergeant held up his hand, silencing his subordinate. Let's say I believe you, Crowe. Let's say these Apache are just passing through peacefully. What guarantee do I have that your negotiation will hold, that they won't change their minds once we ride away? You don't, Tobias admitted, but here's what you do have. My word that I'll personally escort them through my property tonight, that I'll make sure they stay on the path I designate, and that if anything goes wrong, I'll take full responsibility. Your word, the sergeant repeated, and there was skepticism in his tone. Against 300 armed warriors. My word, Tobias said firmly, backed by the fact that I've already convinced them that attacking would cost more than it's worth. I've set up defensive positions that make a frontal assault expensive. They believe I have support, resources, and the tactical advantage. As long as nobody does anything stupid in the next few hours, that belief holds. The sergeant studied him for a long moment. Behind them, the Apache drums had stopped. That silence felt more dangerous than the noise had been. Show me these defensive positions, the sergeant said finally. Tobias felt his heart sink. If the sergeant saw the truth, saw that the positions were mostly empty, constructed from salvaged materials and clever positioning, the entire illusion would collapse. The cavalry would see through the deception, and so would the Apache once word spread. But refusing would make the sergeant suspicious, might prompt him to investigate on his own, or worse, to ride straight into the Apache camp, demanding answers. This way, Tobias said, turning toward the nearest position. As they walked, he calculated rapidly which position looked most convincing from a distance, which one still held together after the night wind, which one might survive a quick inspection without revealing itself as completely fake. They climbed a small rise to where Tobias had positioned the old rifles between rocks. From 50 yards away in good light, the setup looked almost legitimate. Up close, it was obviously antiquated equipment arranged to create an illusion. The sergeant reached the position and stopped. He picked up one of the rifles, examined the rust on the barrel, the missing firing mechanism, the stock that had cracked years ago. Then he set it down carefully and turned to Tobias with an expression that was hard to read. "This is your great defense?" he asked quietly. "Broken rifles and mirrors." Tobias met his gaze without flinching. It's enough to make them think twice. That's all I needed. The sergeant looked back at the valley at the Apache camp in the distance, then at Tobias again. A slow smile spread across his weathered face. Not mockery, something closer to respect. You're either the bravest man I've ever met, he said, or the craziest. Maybe both. I'm just trying to avoid getting killed, Tobias said, and trying to keep everyone else alive in the process. The sergeant nodded slowly, then called to his men. Mount up. We're riding east to Fort Collins, standard patrol route. The young soldier protested. Sir, we have orders to patrol this region and report threats. The sergeant interrupted. I don't see any threats here. Just a rancher negotiating property access. We'll file our report at the fort. If command wants to take action, they can send a full company, but that won't happen for at least 2 days. He turned back to Tobias. You've got your 24 hours, Crowe. Don't make me regret this. The cavalry mounted and rode east, away from the valley, away from potential conflict. Tobias stood alone on the hillside, watching them disappear, feeling relief wash over him like cold water. That relief lasted exactly 30 seconds, because when he turned back toward his cabin, he saw Natan riding toward him alone with an expression that suggested the negotiation had just become significantly more complicated. Natan rode slowly, deliberately, his rifle resting across his saddle within easy reach. His face showed no anger, but the tension in his shoulders told Tobias everything he needed to know. The Apache leader had seen the cavalry scouts, and now he wanted answers. Tobias walked down from the hillside to meet him halfway, keeping his movements calm and unthreatening. The white negotiation flag still stood planted in the ground between them, a reminder of the agreement they'd been building before everything became complicated. Natan stopped his horse 10 ft away. The blue soldiers came from the east. You spoke with them. They rode away. It wasn't a question. It was a statement that demanded explanation. They were a patrol, Tobias said. 6 men on routine duty. They didn't know about your camp. I intercepted them before they could see your position, convinced them to file their report at the fort instead of investigating further. You protected us, Natan said slowly, as if testing the words to see if they made sense. Why? Because if they'd seen 300 warriors camped in this valley, they would have called in reinforcements, and then our negotiation would be worthless. Both sides would be forced to fight. Natan dismounted, a gesture that could have meant trust or simply a desire to speak on equal footing. He walked closer, studying Tobias with those calculating eyes that missed nothing. My scouts watched you, Natan said. Watched you run toward those soldiers, watched you talk with their leader, watched him inspect your defensive position. He paused and something that might have been amusement crossed his face. Watched him pick up your broken rifles. Tobias felt his chest tighten. Then you know the truth. I know you built shadows and called them an army. Natan said, I know you stood between 300 warriors and 6 soldiers and convinced both sides that fighting would be costly. He gestured toward the hillside where the fake defensive position stood exposed. This is your crazy trap. Not weapons, not soldiers. Just one man willing to risk everything on a lie. Not a lie, Tobias corrected quietly. A strategy. There's a difference. Natan nodded slowly. Yes, there is. He turned and looked back toward his camp where hundreds of warriors waited for his decision. My council argued for 3 hours. Some wanted to attack to test whether your defenses were real. Others wanted to go around, find another route, even if it cost us days. A few suggested we should simply kill you and take what we needed. Tobias forced himself to remain still, to not reach for the rifle he'd left leaning against a rock near his cabin. But I told them something, Natan continued. I told them that sometimes the bravest warriors are the ones who choose not to fight, that sometimes strength is knowing when violence serves no purpose. He looked back at Tobias. When I was younger, I would have called that weakness. Now, after many battles, many losses, I understand it differently. What changed your mind? Tobias asked. You did, Natan said simply. Not because of your broken rifles or your mirrors, because you stood in the open knowing we could kill you before you took 3 steps. Because you offered us a path that didn't require blood. Because when those soldiers came, you didn't betray us to save yourself. The wind picked up, carrying dust across the valley floor. In the distance, Tobias could hear the low murmur of the Apache camp. Hundreds of voices discussing, debating, waiting for leadership to make a choice that would determine whether they lived or died. My council has decided, Natan said. We accept your terms. We will cross your land tonight, moving quickly and quietly. You will provide the information about military patrols as promised. In exchange, we take nothing, harm no one, and leave no trace of our passage. Tobias felt relief flood through him, but it was tempered by caution. Negotiations often fell apart in the details, in the execution, in the moment when theory met reality. There's one more thing, Natan said, and his tone shifted slightly. One condition that my council requires before we commit to this agreement. The relief vanished, replaced by weariness. What condition? You will ride with us, Natan said, through the night across your property until we reach the eastern boundary. You will be our guide and our guarantee. If we encounter military patrols, you will speak for us. If there are obstacles, you will help us navigate them. And if you have deceived us about the safe routes, you will be the first to face the consequences. Tobias stared at him. You want me to travel with 300 Apache warriors through territory where any cavalry unit would shoot first and ask questions later. If we're spotted, I'll be seen as a traitor, a collaborator. I'll never be able to return to any settlement, any town, any place where the military has authority. Yes, Natan said calmly. That is the price of trust. You ask us to believe your words, to follow your guidance, to risk our people's safety on your promises. We ask the same of you. Risk your future, your reputation, your life. Then we will know your commitment is real. Tobias looked at his cabin, at the property he'd built over 8 years, at the life he'd constructed after leaving the military. Everything he owned, everything he'd worked for was here. And now he was being asked to risk it all, to put himself in a position where he could lose everything, even if the agreement held. But he'd made harder choices before and lived with them. When do we leave? Tobias asked. Natan's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes suggested approval. 3 hours after sunset, when the moon is high enough to see the path, but low enough to hide our numbers. Bring water, a warm coat, and whatever weapon makes you feel safe. Though if we wanted you dead, no weapon would save you. Comforting, Tobias said dryly. Natan mounted his horse and turned to leave, then paused and looked back. One more thing, Tobias Crowe, the cavalry sergeant who inspected your broken rifles and chose to ride away. What did you say to convince him? I told him the truth, Tobias said, that I was trying to prevent unnecessary death, and he believed you. He did. Natan nodded slowly. Perhaps there is hope for your people after all. He rode back toward the Apache camp, leaving Tobias standing alone in the fading afternoon light, contemplating what he'd just agreed to do. Behind him, in the rocks where his fake defensive position stood, something moved. Tobias spun, hand reaching for the rifle that wasn't there. A young Apache warrior emerged from behind the formation, no older than 18. He'd been hiding there the entire time, listening to every word between Tobias and Natan, every word between Tobias and the cavalry sergeant. The young warrior looked at Tobias for a long moment, then spoke in careful English. Natan sent me to watch you to see if you would betray us to the soldiers, to see if your words matched your actions. And, Tobias asked, his throat suddenly dry. You passed the test, the young warrior said. Then he added something that chilled Tobias more than any threat could have. But the real test comes tonight, when you are alone among 300 warriors who do not trust easily. When one mistake, one wrong word, one moment of doubt could end your life before you could call for help. The warrior disappeared back into the rocks as silently as he'd emerged, leaving Tobias alone with the realization that his crazy trap had worked. But surviving what came next would require more than cleverness. It would require trust on both sides. And trust was the one thing that took years to build and seconds to destroy. The moon rose pale and distant over the valley as Tobias watched 300 Apache warriors prepare for the night crossing. They moved with practiced efficiency, checking horses, securing supplies, organizing into smaller groups that could travel in staggered formation to minimize noise and dust. Tobias stood near his cabin wearing a heavy coat despite the mild evening temperature. Not because he was cold, because the coat had deep pockets where he'd stored dried meat, water flask, matches, and a small knife. The rifle he'd considered bringing stayed propped against his cabin wall. Natan had been right. If 300 warriors wanted him dead, no weapon would make a difference. Natan approached on foot, leading his horse. Behind him walked 4 other men, all older, all carrying themselves with the authority of warriors who'd earned their positions through years of survival. "My counsel," Natan said, gesturing to the men. "They will ride near us during the crossing. They want to hear your guidance directly to judge whether your knowledge is real or another clever deception." One of the council members, a man with gray streaking through his long hair and a scar across his throat that suggested he'd survived something that should have killed him, stepped forward. He spoke in Apache, his tone sharp and questioning. Natan translated. "Greybear asks, how we know you will not lead us into an ambush. How we know the military patrol routes you promised to reveal are not traps designed to destroy us. Tobias met Greybear's gaze directly because I'm riding with you. If we encounter military patrols, I'm the first one they'll shoot. I'm betting my life that the routes I'm giving you are safe." Natan translated. Greybear's expression didn't soften, but he nodded once. A gesture that might have been acknowledgement or simply acceptance that the logic held. "We move now," Natan said. He mounted his horse and gestured for Tobias to do the same. "You ride beside me close enough that my warriors can see you. Far enough that if you try anything foolish, you will not reach me before arrows find you." "Comforting," Tobias muttered, climbing onto his horse. The animal shifted nervously beneath him. Sensing the tension in the air, the presence of so many other horses and riders moving in coordinated silence, the Apache formation began moving east, flowing through the valley like water following the path of least resistance. Tobias rode beside Natan near the front of the main group, with Greybear and the other council members positioned close enough to hear any conversation. For the first hour, they traveled in near total silence. The only sounds were hoofbeats muffled by dry earth. The occasional creak of leather, the soft commands passed in Apache from group leaders to their warriors. Tobias found himself constantly aware of the hundreds of riders surrounding him, the dozens of eyes watching his every movement, judging whether he represented safety or threat. They reached the first critical point just after the moon reached its highest position. A narrow pass between 2 rock formations where the path forced the entire column into a tighter formation. Tobias had warned Natan about this spot during their negotiation. It was the most vulnerable point on the route, the place where a military ambush would be most effective. Natan raised his hand, and the entire column stopped. Scouts rode ahead, disappearing into the darkness beyond the pass. The wait felt endless, measured in heartbeats and shallow breaths. Tobias could feel the tension radiating from every warrior around him. They were experienced enough to know what this pass represented. Strategic enough to understand that if betrayal was coming, this was where it would happen. Greybear rode closer to Tobias, close enough that their horses nearly touched. He spoke in English this time, his voice rough, his accent thick but understandable. If soldiers wait beyond that pass, you die first slowly, so others hear your screams and know the price of betrayal. There are no soldiers, Tobias said quietly. The patrol route I gave Nathan has them 20 miles north of here tonight. They won't be in this area until 3 days from now. You are certain? I'm betting my life on it, Tobias said. Literally. Greybear studied him for a long moment, then spoke in Apache to Nathan. Whatever he said made Natan's jaw tighten. The scouts returned, emerging from the darkness with hand signals that Tobias couldn't fully interpret, but understood the meaning of. The pass was clear. No soldiers, no traps, no danger beyond the natural risk of narrow terrain and darkness. The column moved forward again, flowing through the pass in careful progression. Tobias rode through the narrow space, feeling the weight of rock walls pressing close on both sides. Feeling the hundreds of warriors behind and ahead of him, all of them dependent on his knowledge being accurate, they emerged on the far side without incident. And Tobias felt some of the tension ease from his shoulders, but only some. They still had hours of travel ahead, more vulnerable points to navigate, more opportunities for something to go wrong. Nathan leaned closer as they rode the next patrol route. Where will the soldiers be? Tobias pulled out the rough map he'd drawn earlier, showing it to Nathan in the pale moonlight. There's a creek bed 5 mi east, follows the base of that ridgeline. Military uses it as a supply route because the water keeps the horses fresh. They'll have a camp there, maybe 12 to 15 men rotating guard duty through the night. We cannot avoid the creek, Nathan said. It's the only water source large enough for 300 horses. We don't avoid it, Tobias said. We cross at 3 mi north of their camp, where the creek bends around those hills. The sound of water will cover our movement, but we need to cross in smaller groups, 30 or 40 at a time with gaps between each group. If we all cross at once, even the water won't hide that much noise. Nathan considered this, then nodded. He turned and gave orders in Apache, and Tobias watched as the column began reorganizing itself, breaking into smaller units that would cross the creek in staggered progression. It was a good plan, a safe plan. It would have worked perfectly if not for what happened next. A young warrior, no more than 16, riding near the rear of the formation, suddenly cried out and pointed toward the southern horizon. Tobias turned and saw what had caught the boy's attention. Fire. Multiple fires, maybe a mile away, maybe less in the darkness, and they were moving, which meant they weren't campfires or settlements. They were torches carried by riders coming fast from the south. Someone had seen them, and whoever it was had called for help. Greybear rode up fast, his horse breathing hard, his expression dangerous. He grabbed Tobias by the front of his coat and pulled him close, speaking in broken English, mixed with Apache words Tobias didn't need, translated to understand. You said the route was safe. You said no soldiers would see us. Those aren't military, Tobias said, staring at the approaching torches. Military wouldn't use fire at night. They'd approach dark and quiet. Then who? Nathan demanded, riding up beside Greybear. Tobias felt cold understanding wash over him. Settlers, a hunting party or ranch hands probably. They saw us crossing the valley and rode for the nearest town to raise an alarm. How many? Nathan asked. Tobias counted the torches, calculating roughly. Maybe 20, maybe 30 by the time they gather reinforcements. Can we outrun them? One of the council members asked. With 300 warriors and families? Tobias shook his head. We'd leave a trail a blind man could follow, and by morning there'd be 100 armed settlers and possibly military units converging on this position. Greybear released Tobias's coat, but didn't move away. Then what do we do? Fight? Scatter? Because of your safe route, we are now exposed, hunted with nowhere to hide. Tobias looked at the approaching torches, then at the hundreds of Apache warriors waiting for leadership to make a decision. The crazy trap that had worked so well in the valley, The psychological warfare that had convinced everyone he was more dangerous than he appeared meant nothing out here in open country with witnesses and torches and time running out. But as he stared at those approaching fires, an idea formed, desperate, probably stupid, the kind of plan that would either save everyone or get them all killed. "I need 30 warriors," Tobias said. "The best riders you have, and I need them now." Natan stared at him. For what purpose? To do something even crazier than building an army out of broken rifles? Tobias said, "We're going to ride straight toward those torches, and we're going to convince them we're the last people they want to fight." Gay Bear laughed, but it was the kind of laugh that had no humor in it. "This is your plan? 30 men against however many settlers are coming. This is madness." "Yes," Tobias agreed. "It is, but it's the only chance we have." 30 Apache warriors rode hard beside Tobias toward the approaching torches. They moved in loose formation, spread wide enough to look like more riders than they actually were, close enough to support each other if things went wrong. Tobias had given them simple instructions. Look confident, look organized, look like you're part of something much larger. Most importantly, don't attack unless the settlers attack first. Gray Bear rode at his left shoulder, clearly assigned to watch him, probably to kill him if this turned out to be a trap. The old warrior kept his rifle ready, his eyes constantly scanning the darkness ahead, where the torches bobbed and weaved like angry fireflies. "Explain your plan again," Gray Bear said. "Because riding toward armed settlers while protecting 300 warriors behind us seems like choosing death quickly instead of slowly." "The settlers don't know how many Apache are in the valley," Tobias said, keeping his voice steady despite the fear making his hands shake. "They saw movement, saw numbers, and rode for help. But they're scared. Civilians aren't trained for this. They're ranchers and farmers pretending to be soldiers because someone told them Indians mean danger." "We do mean danger," Gray Bear pointed out. "That is not a lie. But you're not here to raid or kill," Tobias said. "You're passing through. The settlers don't know that. They think you're a war party. So we're going to show them something that makes them think twice about engaging by riding straight at them with 30 warriors. By riding straight at them with 30 warriors who look like the advanced guard of a much larger, much more organized military force." Tobias pointed ahead to where the torches had stopped moving. The settlers had seen them coming and were forming up, probably debating whether to advance or hold position. "Watch what happens when we get close enough for them to see details." They rode closer, and Tobias could now make out individual riders in the torchlight. 23 men, as far as he could count. Most carried rifles. A few had pistols. All of them looked nervous. These weren't experienced fighters. They were neighbors who'd armed themselves because rumors of Apache movements scared them more than the reality of what they were facing. Tobias raised his hand, and the Apache warriors slowed their approach, stopping about 100 yards from the settler formation, close enough to be clearly visible, far enough to avoid immediate conflict. One of the settlers, a heavy man on a spotted horse, urged his mount forward a few paces. "Identify yourselves," he called out. His voice shook slightly, betraying the fear he was trying to hide. Tobias rode forward alone, moving slowly, keeping his hands visible. "My name is Tobias Crowe. I own property in the valley west of here. Some of you might know me." "Crowe," another settler called out, the scout who went native. The accusation hung in the air. Tobias had known this moment might come when his choice to negotiate rather than fight would be seen as betrayal by his own people. "I left military service 8 years ago," Tobias said calmly. "But I still understand how to prevent unnecessary bloodshed. These Apache warriors are under escort. They're moving east to reach reservation territory. I've negotiated safe passage through this region." "Under whose authority?" the heavy man demanded. "My own," Tobias said, "and the authority of wanting to keep everyone alive tonight. You've got 23 men. Behind me are 30 Apache warriors. and behind them in that valley are nearly 300 more. If you attack, you might kill some of us, but the rest will scatter into these hills, raid every ranch and settlement within 50 mi, and then the military will come, and this whole territory will become a war zone." He paused, letting that sink in, then continued. "Or you can turn around, ride back to your homes, and tomorrow morning you can tell everyone that you encountered a large Apache force moving east under controlled escort, and that force will be gone from this territory within 12 hours. The settlers looked at each other, uncertainty clear on their faces. They'd come expecting to chase off raiders or at least harass a small group of Apache families. Instead, they'd found themselves facing organized warriors backed by numbers they couldn't match. A younger settler, barely old enough to grow a beard, spoke up. "How do we know they won't come back? How do we know this isn't just a trick to get us to lower our guard?" "You don't," Tobias admitted, "but I'm giving you my word. These Apache are leaving this territory permanently. They're heading east to join reservation lands. They have no interest in your ranches, your livestock, or your families. They just want to pass through without violence." Gay Bear rode forward to join Tobias, a move that made several settlers raise their rifles nervously. The old warrior spoke in clear English, his rough voice carrying across the space between the two groups. "I am Gray Bear. I have fought in more battles than all of you have lived years. I have killed men who threatened my people. I would do so again, if necessary." He paused, letting the threat settle. "But tonight, we do not seek battle. We seek only passage. This man," he gestured to Tobias, "has shown us a path that avoids conflict. If you force us to fight, you will lose, but so will we. So will your families when our warriors scatter into these hills seeking revenge for fallen brothers." The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the nervous shifting of horses and the crack of burning torches. The heavy settler looked back at his men, saw their fear, their uncertainty, their lack of real military training or leadership. Then he looked at Tobias again. "If any Apache raid happens in this territory in the next month, we're holding you responsible, Crowe, whether you're still here or not." "Fair enough," Tobias said. "Now ride back to town. Tell them what you saw. Tell them a large force passed through under escort. Tell them I took responsibility. And tell them that by sunrise, this whole situation will be resolved." The settler nodded slowly, then turned his horse. "Mount up," he called to his men. "We're riding back." Not all the settlers looked happy about retreating, but none of them argued. They turned and began riding south, their torches gradually disappearing into the darkness. Tobias and the 30 Apache warriors waited until the torches were completely gone before turning back toward the valley where the main Apache force waited. Gray Bear rode close beside Tobias as they returned. "You convinced them without fighting again. This crazy trap of yours using words and fear instead of weapons. It works more often than it should because most people don't actually want to fight. Tobias said they just need a reason not to. I give them that reason." They reached the main Apache force where Natan waited with obvious tension. When he saw all 30 warriors returning unharmed, relief crossed his face briefly before his expression returned to neutral. "The settlers?" Natan asked. "Gone?" Tobias said, "Convince them we were too organized and too numerous to engage. They'll spread word that a large Apache force is moving through under escort, which means most civilians will stay clear until you're out of the territory." Natan studied him for a long moment. "You risk much for people who are not your own. Why?" Tobias thought about that question, about all the choices that had led him to this moment. "Maybe because I'm tired of seeing people die over misunderstandings. Maybe because I believe there's a better way than constant violence. Or maybe I'm just too stubborn to accept that killing each other is the only option we have." Natan nodded slowly, then called out orders in Apache. The column began moving again, reorganizing for the creek crossing that would take them out of the most dangerous territory. As they rode, Gray Bear moved close to Tobias one more time. When we reach the eastern boundary of your land, we part ways. You return to your ranch. We continue to reservation territory. But I want you to know something, Tobias Crowe. What's that? If you had betrayed us tonight, if soldiers had been waiting in that pass, or if those settlers had been an ambush, I was ordered to kill you. Gray Bear's expression was serious, but not threatening. But you did not betray us. You protected us, risked your reputation with your own people, stood between us and violence. This will not be forgotten. I don't need it remembered, Tobias said. I just need everyone to survive the night. Some debts cannot be forgotten, Gray Bear said. Someday, perhaps we will have the chance to repay what you have done here. They rode in silence after that, the column moving steadily east through the night. The moon had begun its descent toward the western horizon. Dawn was still hours away, but Tobias could feel the night shifting, moving toward its conclusion. They reached the creek bed Tobias had identified earlier. True to his word, there were no soldiers, no patrols, no unexpected complications. The crossing went smoothly. Small groups of warriors moving through the shallow water in staggered progression, the sound of their passage masked by the natural flow of the creek. By the time the last group had crossed, the eastern sky was beginning to show the first pale hints of approaching dawn. Natan rode up beside Tobias as they approached what Tobias recognized as the eastern boundary of his property. By this point, the land belonged to the government, designated territory that would eventually become reservation lands. This is where we part, Natan said. Your guidance has been accurate. Your promises have held true. The agreement is fulfilled. Tobias nodded, suddenly feeling exhausted in a way that went beyond physical tiredness. Safe travels. And Natan, when you reach the reservation, when you're settling in, tell your people about tonight. Tell them that sometimes the way through isn't around or over obstacles. Sometimes it's straight through using nothing but words and the willingness to take risks. I will tell them, Natan said. And I will tell them about the crazy trap that one man built to stop 300 warriors, not with weapons or armies, but with the simple courage to stand in the gap and refused to let violence be the only answer. He raised his hand in a gesture of respect, then rode east to join his people. Tobias sat alone on his horse, watching as 300 Apache warriors disappeared into the early morning darkness, heading toward an uncertain future, but at least heading toward it alive. He turned his horse west, back toward his ranch, back toward the life he'd built, back toward whatever consequences awaited him for the choices he'd made tonight. The sun was just breaking the eastern horizon when Tobias saw the riders approaching from the west. 4 men in blue cavalry uniforms, and they were riding straight toward him. Tobias recognized the lead rider immediately, the weathered cavalry sergeant from the day before, the man who'd inspected his broken rifles and chosen to ride away, the sergeant who'd given him 24 hours to resolve the situation peacefully. Those 24 hours were now up. Tobias urged his tired horse forward to meet them, knowing that running would be pointless and fighting would be suicide. Whatever consequences were coming, he'd faced them the same way he'd faced everything else in the past 2 days. Directly, the sergeant raised his hand, and the 4 cavalry riders stopped 20 yards away. They looked alert, but not aggressive. Rifles in their saddle holsters rather than in their hands. That was something at least. Crowe, the sergeant said, his voice neutral. Long night, long enough? Tobias replied. His throat felt raw from dust and exhaustion. You came to check if I kept my word. I did. The sergeant dismounted and walked closer, studying Tobias with those sharp eyes that missed nothing. We rode a wide patrol through the night, stayed clear of your valley like I promised, but we watched the ridges, listened for gunfire, looked for signs of trouble, and Tobias asked, though he already knew the answer, and we saw smoke signals from settler groups reporting Apache movement, saw torchlights in the hills around midnight, heard reports of a large force moving east under some kind of escort. The sergeant paused, then added, "We also heard reports of you riding with that force. Of you negotiating with settlers, preventing conflict, guiding 300 Apache warriors through territory where any one of them could have been shot on sight." Tobias said nothing. There wasn't much he could say that would make the situation better or worse than it already was. The sergeant walked closer, close enough that Tobias could see the fatigue in his face, the weight of decisions made in darkness when there were no good options, only less terrible ones. "I should arrest you," the sergeant said quietly. "By military law, by territorial law, probably by any law that matters. What you did last night constitutes aiding hostile forces. At minimum, it's collaboration. At worst, it's treason." "I know," Tobias said. "But here's what I also know," the sergeant continued. "This morning, I received reports from 3 different settler groups. None of them reported attacks. None of them reported stolen livestock or burned property. None of them reported casualties." He gestured toward the eastern horizon where the sun was now fully risen. 300 Apache warriors passed through this territory in a single night, and the only thing that got hurt was people's pride, and maybe their assumptions about how these situations have to end. One of the younger cavalry riders spoke up from behind the sergeant. "Sir, regulations state that I'm aware of regulations. Private," the sergeant interrupted without turning around. "I'm also aware of results. And the result here is that we avoided what could have been a week-long conflict, dozens of casualties on both sides, and probably a full military campaign that would have cost the government thousands of dollars and dozens of lives." He turned back to Tobias. "So, here's what I'm going to put in my official report. I'm going to write that a large Apache force was spotted moving east through territorial land. That local property owner, Tobias Crowe, former military scout, used his knowledge of Apache tactics and language to negotiate peaceful passage rather than immediate engagement. That this negotiation prevented conflict and allowed the Apache force to reach their intended destination without incident." "You're not arresting me," Tobias said, and it wasn't quite a question, more a statement of disbelief. "I'm not arresting you," the sergeant confirmed. "But I am ordering you to report to Fort Collins within 3 days to provide a full account of the night's events, including detailed information about Apache numbers, leadership, weapons, and intentions. That information will help us prevent future conflicts. And if I refuse, then I will arrest you," the sergeant said flatly. "And you'll answer the same questions from a cell instead of across a desk. Your choice." Tobias nodded slowly. "I'll report in 3 days. See that you do?" The sergeant turned to mount his horse, then paused and looked back. "One more thing, Crowe. That crazy trap you built with broken rifles and mirrors, that took guts. Stupid guts, maybe, but guts. You could have gotten yourself killed a dozen different ways last night, but you didn't. And 300 Apache warriors made it safely to their destination. And 20-some terrified settlers got to go home to their families, and 4 cavalry scouts didn't have to fire a single shot." The sergeant swung up into his saddle. "Maybe there's something to your way of doing things. Or maybe you just got lucky. Either way, you've got 3 days." The cavalry riders turned and headed north toward Fort Collins, leaving Tobias alone on the empty plain. And as the morning sun climbed higher, he turned his horse west and rode slowly back toward his property, feeling every mile in his bones, every decision in his chest. When he finally reached his ranch, everything looked exactly as he'd left it. The cabin stood undamaged. His fence line remained intact. The wooden frames and broken rifles that had formed his crazy trap still stood on the distant hills, monuments to a deception that had worked better than anyone had the right to expect. Tobias dismounted and walked to the nearest defensive position. He picked up one of the old rifles, felt its weight, examined the rust that covered the barrel, the mechanisms that no longer functioned. This piece of broken metal, combined with mirrors and ceramic jars, and the willingness to bluff against impossible odds, had stopped 300 Apache warriors without a single shot being fired, had convinced experienced fighters that attacking would cost more than it was worth, had bought enough time to negotiate, to build trust, to find a solution that let everyone walk away breathing. He set the rifle down carefully and walked to the edge of his property. Looking east toward where the Apache had disappeared into the morning light. Somewhere out there, Natan was leading his people to safety. Gray Bear was probably still grumbling about crazy strategies that shouldn't work, but somehow did. 300 warriors and their families were one step closer to whatever uncertain future waited for them on reservation lands. They'd made it through because one man had been willing to stand in the gap, to risk everything on the belief that violence wasn't the only answer, that sometimes the craziest plan was the one that made the most sense. Tobias thought about the sergeant's question. Why had he left military service? He'd left because he'd been tired of accepting that violence was inevitable, that death was the expected outcome, that good people had to keep killing each other because that's just how things worked. Last night, he'd proven something different was possible. Not easy, not safe, not guaranteed to work, but possible. He walked back to his cabin and stood in the doorway, looking at the life he'd built over 8 years. The simple furniture he'd made with his own hands, the maps on the walls marking property boundaries and water sources, the rifle propped in the corner that he'd barely used in all the time he'd lived here. This was home. This was the life he'd chosen after walking away from war. And last night, he'd managed to protect it without becoming the thing he'd left behind. Tobias took off his coat, hung it carefully on a peg, and walked inside to finally sleep. Outside on the distant hills, his crazy trap of broken rifles and empty shadows stood silent in the morning sun. A monument to the idea that sometimes the best weapon isn't the one that kills, but the one that convinces everyone that killing isn't necessary. The Apache were gone. The settlers were safe. The cavalry had avoided conflict. And Tobias Crowe, a rancher who'd built an army out of nothing but courage and deception, had proven that 300 warriors could be stopped not by force, but by one man willing to stand alone and refuse to accept that violence was the only way forward. The trap had worked. The crazy, impossible, shouldn't have succeeded trap had worked, and everyone had survived to tell about it. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale from the untamed frontier, where courage and impossible choices shape destinies in ways you never expected. Don't forget to subscribe and consider leaving a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.